Do any of these pictures feel familiar to you? Do they remind you of something that you just can't put your finger on? Do they make you feel nostalgic or reminiscent of something? Do they give you a sense of hope and optimism? If so, you're not alone. All these pictures are examples of a once ubiquitous, yet relatively unknown aesthetic called Frutiger Aero. Frutiger Aero is a design aesthetic popular during the mid-2000s to the early 2010s. The Frutiger Aero aesthetic is characterized by its glossy design, tertiary color palettes, Frutiger humanist sans serif fonts, glass, bubbles, auroras, bokeh, and its use of grass and nature. These interesting design elements all come together to create a rather distinct and, in my opinion, pleasant aesthetic. Frutiger Aero was most prevalent in branding, user interface design, product design, advertising, and pretty much everything quote-unquote corporate during this era. Just as the wave of minimalism struck every single business over the past 5 years, so too Frutiger Aero was adopted by pretty much every company from around 2004 to 2011. Another aspect of Frutiger Aero is Skeomorphism, which is a user interface design featuring UI elements that mimic physical objects, think iOS 5 or Android Jelly Bean. Technically, Skeomorphism is a separate aesthetic from Frutiger Aero, but the two are often intertwined and can go hand in hand. But there's a difference. Skeomorphism is a term strictly used for technological, web, or user interface design. Frutiger Aero, on the other hand, is not limited to just tech and UI design, but can be used in other ways, such as the packaging of this soap bottle or this promotional poster. To put things simply, most Skeomorphism is also Frutiger Aero, but not everything Frutiger Aero is Skeomorphism. For example, these naturescapes are classic Frutiger Aero. They use realistic textures and real-world objects, but because they're not in a user interface setting, they're not skeomorphic. But if you applied that realism and texture to a user interface, then it would be skeomorphism. If you're still confused, think of the glossy 3D design popular in the mid-2000s as an umbrella category, with Frutiger Aero and skeomorphism falling under that umbrella. Another important component of Frutiger Aero is its utilization of something called humanism, which in design is the concept of creating something to be relatable and accessible to the most amount of people possible. It is likened to, quote-unquote, casting a wide net that embraces all humans. In the case of Frutiger Aero, humanism is demonstrated by the use of nature, people, and other real-world items to provide a sense of familiarity and ease to its viewers. This was especially important regarding the user interface aspect of Frutiger Aero. See, by the 2000s, many people were already familiar with smart technology and the internet, but there were still plenty of non-techie people who were confused and overwhelmed by it. Frutiger Aero and Skeomorphism used humanism to make it easier for less tech-savvy people to become comfortable with the new, rapidly evolving technology by letting them interact with familiar items and scenes before transitioning them to the more abstract tech landscape that we see today, which would have overwhelmed and put off many consumers back in the 2000s. The Wii is a great example of a product that used humanism via Frutiger Aero to boost its accessibility to the masses. Another example is how humanism is often used in the branding of technology made for seniors, where packaging and software often use people and nature to try to make things feel more natural and appealing. So yes, Frutiger Aero seemed like an effort to get non-tech savvy people comfortable with technology, using humanism to make things more appealing and accessible. And it kinda worked. Thanks to Frutiger Aero, many people who were weary or confused by technology started to give it a try and ended up getting used to it. Now that most people were on board, Frutiger Aero could transition into the more minimalistic and utilitarian user interfaces and branding that we see today. And while it's easy to dive deep into an analysis on Frutiger Aero, humanism, and its true motives, it's still just a design aesthetic, and most of the reason why it was used is simply because it was a popular style at the time, just like in every decade. Now that you're familiar with the aesthetic, here's some examples of Frutiger Aero in use. Some other examples of Frutiger Aero are the Galaxy S4 user interface and marketing, which also seeps of humanism, by the way. Frutiger Aero is also used in many company logos, like the AT&T logo, product packaging and branding, such as Pure Life Water, and corporate graphics, like this. A similar aesthetic to Frutiger Aero, or rather its predecessor, is the Y2K tech/futurism aesthetic of the late 90s. In fact, it's believed that Frutiger Aero is the direct successor of this aesthetic, using the same futuristic, technological, and visionary tones, as well as the shiny and realistic textures. Another similar aesthetic to Frutiger Aero, if not a branch of it, is Funky Seasons, a marketing design technique where Frutiger Aero is utilized in conjunction with multicolored products or items, also popular in the mid-2000s and the early 2010s. Some examples of Funky Seasons are the colorful iPod Nanos, the iPhone 5Cs, and the iPod and iTunes branding. Some sources say that Funky Seasons is a separate aesthetic, but I personally think that it's just a branch of Frutiger Aero. Now, despite all the pleasant things about Frutiger Aero, there is a sort of dark irony about it as well. See, Frutiger Aero promised us this utopic future, all while serving as a tool that helped us get to this less than utopic reality. By helping transition people into the world of technology, Frutiger Aero had an accidental role in bringing us to the state of big tech monopolies, censorship, surveillance, and digital psychosis. It ended up leading us to the exact opposite of the future that it hoped we would have. The fact that we are currently living in the quote-unquote future that Frutiger Aero conceptualized, and the fact that it's not at all what the aesthetic made it out to be, is just another layer of icing on the irony cake. And it's true that if it weren't for Frutiger Aero, we probably wouldn't be as technologically dependent as we are today. But overall, Frutiger Aero did much more to evolve humanity than to decline it. Because although there are many downsides that come along with technology, it still improved our quality of life and changed the world for the good. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that it's just a graphic design style. It's really not that deep. On a completely different note, there seems to be a surprisingly little amount of information about Frutiger Aero, which is rather strange considering how popular of an aesthetic it is. Perhaps it's sort of a tough aesthetic to define, or maybe it's become so unanimous that people just got used to it and don't really even see it as an aesthetic. Either way, I've actually loved the Frutiger Aero aesthetic for a long time, but I didn't know it was actually a real thing, or let alone that it had a name, until I stumbled upon the Frutiger Aero subreddit and realized that it was an actual aesthetic. There's a Frutiger Aero page on the Aesthetics Fandom Wiki, a Frutiger Aero subreddit, and a Frutiger Aero Facebook group for some reason, but besides that, there really isn't much else about the aesthetic online. However, if you keep your eyes peeled, you'll be able to spot tons of Frutiger Aero examples in your daily life. Because even though its prime days ended in the early mid-2010s, you can still find tons of remnants of it today. It still sometimes appears on signs, stores, web graphics, marketing, branding, and logos that were made back when Frutiger Aero was popular. Some user interfaces also still utilize this aesthetic as well. Personally, Frutiger Aero is one of my all-time favorite design aesthetics. Its bright and optimistic tones give it a sense of visionary inspiration. Its utilization of humanism makes it feel pleasant and familiar. And of course, its nostalgia factor makes it such an endearing reminder of simpler times. Frutiger Aero is peculiar and wonderful in that it seems to be reminding us of a familiar past, yet also hinting us toward an optimistic, almost utopic future. In this way, Frutiger Aero is possibly a reflection of the collective excitement people held in the 2000s for what the 21st century would have in store. And the fact that the aesthetic was so widely used, yet so unacknowledged, adds a slightly uncanny feeling to the mix. Similarly, the fact that we are currently living in the world that Frutiger Aero was pointing towards, and the fact that it's not at all what the aesthetic hoped it would be, adds a twinge of cynicism to contrast the innocence and optimism that the aesthetic portrays. No matter what you think of it, it's safe to say that Frutiger Aero is one of the most intriguing and inspiring design aesthetics to date, and it will always have a soft spot in my heart. Wait! The video's not over yet! As I was editing this video, I noticed some things that I wanted to clarify. First, I want to say that although it's common for Frutiger Aero UIs to be skeomorphic, it's not always the case. Some are just plain Frutiger Aero. Second, I forgot to mention that these types of flourishes and geometric designs are also a characteristic of Frutiger Aero. Also, as you've probably noticed, Frutiger Aero is a broad aesthetic, ranging from stock pictures to technology to interior design to branding to user interfaces, and each of those could probably be their own specific aesthetics, but in the video I included them all as broadly Frutiger Aero. One more thing I want to mention is that I was all over the place with my pronunciation of Frutiger Aero. I think I said Frutiger Aero at one point in the video. It's kind of a mouthful, so I did mess up a few times, but to clarify, it's pronounced Frutiger Aero. I think some people say Frutiger Aero as well, but when I looked it up, the European pronunciation, which is where the word originated, is with a ger, not jur, so I just went with that. Also, please note that a lot of the information here was just my opinion and my take. Just want to put a little disclaimer in there. Don't take everything I said as 100%. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something.